Welcome to another episode of the SNA Speakeasy. We have a very great guest, I think, today. His name is Cedric Alviani, and he is the East Asia Bureau Chief, or head of the East Asia Division of Reporters Without Borders, also known as RSF. And of course, we're going to talk about the issue of press freedom in East Asia, and especially because his organization has just a week or two ago issued its 2020 index. So let's start with that. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how it is that you came to get this position that you're in now?
Hello, Michael. I'm Cedric Alviani. I'm a French national. I've been based in Asia for the past 20 years, mostly in Taiwan, and I'm glad to be the head of Reporters Without Borders East Asia office that is located in Taipei for already 3 years.
And what did you do before? I mean, how did you get to that position? It's a very, I don't know, glamorous position to have. How did you get to it?
Oh, I graduated as a reporter, but actually I didn't work most as a reporter. I worked for the French diplomacy. I worked as an entrepreneur organizing events in the field of culture. And I was for a while the head of a nonprofit business organization here in Taiwan called France-Taiwan Chamber of Commerce.
Okay, excellent. So we just had the 2020 index come out. So for those who may have read it last year but haven't read the new version, what would you say are the biggest changes in our region?
Well, biggest changes in our region is South Korea going back to the last rank in the index. We evaluate 180 countries and territories, and traditionally South Korea is the last
You mean North Korea?
because there is sorry, North Korea, because there is no independent journalists at all in North Korea. Last year, Eritrea managed to be even sorry, last year Turkmenistan managed to be even worse due to violence against journalists, but this year North Korea is back to the bottom of the index. The other, of course, the major worry of Reporters Without Borders in the region is the growing influence of China. That is not only increasing censorship and surveillance of journalists within its borders, but that is also very actively trying to establish a new media order outside its borders, trying to control the narrative of international media on China, and also trying to suppress independent journalism and replace it with another kind of journalism that is state propaganda.
I
And
see.
this is, of course, the major concern of Reporters Without Borders. The other moves in the index are not so important. South Korea and Taiwan, which are the two freest places for press freedom in the whole Asia, are down one rank each, but it's actually more of a mechanical movement because you know that since the index is listing countries, there can be only one country or territory per rank. And if there are some movements, then other countries are automatically moving. In the case of Taiwan and South Korea, the situation is quite stable. And indeed, Reporters Without Borders is actively pushing the authorities in both countries to bring improvements to the situation of journalists and to the actual press freedom, because of course you have press freedom on the paper and you necessarily have limitations. Uh, Japan does a little bit better. I would say that this is also a mechanical movement because there are still a lot of obstacles in Japan to a truly like a free press, although the situation is the situation of a democracy, but there's a lot of cultural and institutional obstacles that hinder the possibility for journalists to make independent reporting on any topic and have it published.
Okay. Um, so let's take these in turn through the countries that are within your mandate. So clearly, at the bottom of the list, as you mentioned, not only the bottom of the East Asia list, but the bottom of the world list is North Korea. I suppose we can dispose of this rather quickly with a question. Is there any independent or any kind of media freedom whatsoever in North Korea at this point? Or is it essentially 100% any media of all sorts is government controlled?
No, there is no media freedom at all in North Korea. And the technological revolution, the equipment of North Koreans with smartphones has not really changed things since the internet is merely an intranet. Everything is controlled, and the only way known for North Koreans to share independent information is to use USB dongles, which is quite inconvenient and dangerous. Recently, during the COVID-19 outbreak, North Korea has consistently been claimed that there are no cases of COVID-19, despite a lot of evidence on the contrary. It's, of course, impossible for journalists to independently verify this information. North Korea, a few years ago, has accepted the presence of Western media agencies, but actually their power is very limited. The staff is local staff, and they are working under the control of the North Korean authorities. So even these foreign media agencies do not have much power to actually verify this information. But the good thing, and at least there is one little glimpse of hope with North Korea, is that through these foreign media agencies, the public can actually have access to a lot of pictures taken in North Korea, and this at least allows us to better understand the way the people are living, because pictures can be commented by the media agencies outside of North Korea. The pictures, although there are pictures that were approved by the North Korean authorities, but they are still allowing the media to know something on North Korea. So I would say that's the only little glimpse of hope.
Okay. And I imagine that the next up on the list would probably be what, mainland China from North Korea?
Yes, of course,
And
of course.
I mean, obviously in this case we have a one-party state, but at the same time a much larger and more complex and society than North Korea is. So if you're working in a newsroom in mainland China, and let's say you're a reporter going after a story, how much freedom should you expect in that situation? Is it just a matter of there are taboo areas you can't touch, or are there areas where you can do real journalism in mainland China?
Of course, situation in mainland China can't easily be compared to the one in North Korea. There are a lot of media in the mainland, and it's impossible for the authorities to exert the same level of control as it is done in North Korea. The media in China have never been totally free, but in the early 2000s, there has been a tendency for them to gain more and more freedom. And at the time, actually, of the SARS epidemic in 2003, the Chinese media very actively reporting on the epidemic. There was also the scandal of the AIDS villages in the early 2000s. That was reported by the Chinese media. So there was a tendency for improvements that was totally stopped when President Xi Jinping came into power in 2013. And actually, since that moment, there has been a consistent crackdown on independent journalism, a consistent set of measures reducing the space of expression of journalists. It started, of course, with the state media and the mainstream media that are now considered by the authorities as an official relay of the party's propaganda. There has been a very violent crackdown on citizen journalists, this category of persons who become journalists because they realize that the news are not, that the mainstream media are not reporting certain categories of news. And actually, a lot of them have been put in jail and sentenced with very harsh sentences. Just last week, an independent journalist in China was sentenced 15 years jail for reporting on the corruption of the Communist Party's executive. This is an incredible harsh sentence, and unfortunately, he's not the only one. Currently, at least 112 journalists are jailed in China.
Are there any cases of journalists actually being assassinated in China, or is it just they get imprisoned?
No, actually, China doesn't assassinate journalists, but the conditions of life in Chinese jails are so bad that actually after a few years, detention, the journalist's health is damaged forever. So actually, in 2017, two defenders of freedom of information, including Nobel Prize Liu Xiaobo, died in the Chinese jails of cancers that were not being taken care of during their detention. And we're, of course, we're afraid that more of these journalists would die in detention. So talking about China, it is now an established matter that if journalists had been able to freely report on the coronavirus epidemic at the time it started in the city of Wuhan, it is likely that the epidemic would have been tackled much earlier and that it would never have left the borders of China. It is not, of course, to say that China is responsible for the current pandemic that comes from a lot of different factors, but it's still very important that the world would realize that the problem of censorship in China, just like in any country in the world, is not the problem of the Chinese. It is a global problem that might have some very important repercussions on other countries. After COVID-19, no one can ever say that censorship somewhere is the problem of the people who live there. It is a global problem and it has to be tackled by the international community as a global problem. So we are calling on democracies in the world to unite and to mobilize against censorship so that the Chinese authorities would not be able and spread their model, because they are currently very actively selling their authoritarian model and the tools they use for that control to more and more countries, including, of course, the ones that take part in the Belt and Road Initiative Economic Development Project. And many of these countries are already have an authoritarian government. And of course, the fact that China would provide the tools, the regulation, and an encouragement for them to be even more authoritarian is a threat for the whole world.
Okay, well, let's take a look over at Hong Kong, which is under the sovereignty of the Chinese government, but is a separate system. How much difference is there between being a journalist in mainland China compared to being a journalist in Hong Kong?
Well, there is still a huge difference, of course, and it's definitely possible to do independent reporting in Hong Kong. And actually, in the past years, Hong Kong has seen the development of a certain number of very interesting online media that engage in ethical journalism and that make a lot of efforts to be accountable to their readers. some of them were crowdfunded. They do not work with a lot of money or lots of resources, but they do a very important work to keep, to allow Hong Kong people to still access independent information. So yes, it's possible to do journalism in Hong Kong, but the space is reducing every day. During the umbrella movement, there had been a first wave of physical violence against journalists that had stopped after the movement, but it was back last year during the massive demonstrations for democracy. A lot of journalists have been attacked, not only by the police, but some of them by some pro-Beijing mobs, and very violently. The government, the Hong Kong executive, is also consistently siding with Beijing on the Beijing's requests and consistently interprets the request from the mainland as superseding the basic law, which is, of course, a major concern because according to the treaty signed between the United Kingdom and China for the handover of Hong Kong, the basic law, as decided, is supposed to rule until 2047, and it very clearly states that Hong Kong have the benefit of freedom of expression and a free press. And day after day, the Chinese authorities, with the complicity of the executive power, are trying to reduce this space of freedom.
Okay. So, among the remaining countries in East Asia that you cover are what? Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, correct?
Yes. Well,
So,
South Korea is a very interesting
well,
case,
well, hold on a
actually.
second. So, among those three, which has the least free press according to your index?
Sorry, amongst North Korea, South Korea,
South Korea
Taiwan,
and Japan.
oh, Japan,
Okay.
definitely Japan.
So let's
Although, yeah,
so let's go to Japan. So what is you know Japanese probably wouldn't like to be told that they have a less free media than Taiwan and South Korea. So explain what is in your view the major thing that's holding back freedom of the press in this country.
yeah. First thing to say is that Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are democracies. They all have in their regulation and in their constitution freedom of the press, and they all enforce the basic standards of freedom of the press. So the purpose, even if our ranking is creating a distinction between these countries, but the purpose is not to say that some of them do not respect freedom of the press. Japan is a country where independent journalism can be done, where it is possible to have free expression and to publish articles or information that the authorities do not like. We perfectly know this. But I would say compared to Taiwan and South Korea, there are certain obstacles in Japan that make it harder for journalists to deal with certain topics and to distribute information to the public. We must keep in mind that freedom of the press is not simply the freedom for media owners to distribute content. It's considered when you read Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the right of the citizens to receive and impart information. Freedom of the press is made for the benefits of the citizens, not for the benefit of media owners. In the case of Japan, we have some very powerful media groups, but there is a very heavy self-censorship that comes from the fact that these media groups are also engaged in other types of activities, entertainment activities, business activities. They need good relationship with the Japanese authorities, and therefore they are reluctant to publish some news that would trigger the ire from these authorities. There are, on the other side, independent media and independent journalists in Taiwan, but since they are not allowed to be members of the press clubs, the famous Kisha clubs.
You mean in Japan?
Yes, in Japan,
Yeah.
it's very difficult. It's very difficult for these independent journalists to even have access to government sources or official sources. So this is truly a barrier for them. It's very hard to report on certain topics if you cannot talk to the administration, if you cannot talk to official sources. So this is one strong limitation. There are also in Japan some cultural barriers. Let's talk about the situation of women journalists, for example. Although Japan is one of the leading democracies in the world and that it should set an example, the situation of women journalists in Japan is extremely bad, and it truly hinders the ability for the media to report on female-related topics. There is, according to the last figures I saw, if I remember, there is less than 2% women on the top management of the media in Japan, and the ratio of female journalists, if I don't mistake, is under 20%, which is truly, let's say, an exception if you consider economically developed countries. The Japanese journalists are also submitted to a constant harassment, not only in their workplace or from their management colleagues, but also from the sources they interview. And this is something that so far hasn't had so much attention from the authorities, and which hopefully we believe will change in the coming years. So these are just a few examples, but there's a lot of censorship. It's very difficult to talk about the mafia in Japan, about the Yakuza. It's very difficult to talk about topics that are considered as a national embarrassment, like the disaster of Fukushima, or like the US military bases in Okinawa, for example. So these are topics on which reporters can't freely talk, or the ones that freely report on the topic find it very hard to have their reports published.
Okay, well, that's part of the reason why SNA exists, is to talk about these issues. We're marginalized, but we're free to do it. So, as of the two countries that remain, South Korea and Taiwan, so which one is the second best in terms of freedom of the press?
Second best is Taiwan. Taiwan was, for 6 years in a row, the actually freest place in the whole Asia. And last year it has lost its first place to South Korea, that was just one rank higher in our index. Well, the situation in Taiwan is actually the situation of every democracy. There is a free press, but it operates for the benefit of its owner, its business. It's very sensationalistic, and it does not necessarily allow citizens to take educated decisions. It doesn't necessarily engage in the important debates. So the problem in Taiwan is basically the problem of the absence of the lack of quality of the media environment. We are actually very actively trying to engage with the government so that they would take some measures to better regulate, not control the media, but regulate the media environment, so that journalists would be better protected, so that the public media would have more resource and independence, so that media literacy or the fight against disinformation would be better taken in consideration by the authorities.
So you say that they're not offering the quality that they should, and that the debate isn't as rich as it should be. As in a society like Taiwan, what's holding them back? You mentioned the owners that owners maybe have something to do with it, but if there's a good journalist, a good story to be pursued, why aren't the media engaging in these things and getting readers through good quality journalism?
There are good stories and good journalists in Taiwan, but the information they produce is drowned in the middle of a huge lot of information that is actually close to circus. The major problem in Taiwan is that a big part of the public has been used to considering that news is some kind of a circus. There has to be sensationalistic information every day, and nobody really cares that the media do the proper verification work. And it's very difficult for journalists to work in this environment because they are being asked to produce a lot of clickbait stories, and they are not being given sufficient time and resource so that they can double check and make a work as excellent as they would like. It's not at all the fault of the journalists, it's the problem of the system they are being stuck in. And when you have to pay the bills and you work as a journalist, if you resign from media, but then you work for their competitor that does the exact same practices, it doesn't change anything. So that's why it's very important that Reporters Without Borders would point out these problems and engage with the government so they solve it.
Okay, excellent. And well, that leaves us with our star case in East Asia, which is South Korea. I'm sure all the South Koreans out there are happy to hear it.
Yeah.
So, why has South Korea become the best place to do journalism in all of East Asia?
Yeah, so before talking about South Korea, I just want to mention one more thing about Taiwan, which
Please.
is that there is, of course, a very strong influence from China. The Chinese authorities are very actively trying to pressure on the Taiwanese media so that some of them would cover the narrative from the Communist Party. It works because some Taiwanese media tycoons have very strong links with China. Some of them have huge businesses in China, so of course they are prone to any kind of pressure, and it's easier and easier for the Chinese authorities to push their narrative. So this is another concern for Taiwan. So now, yeah, answering your question on South Korea, it has not always been so nice. And actually, in the past decade, the past two presidents and their administrations have very actively engaged in trying and control and pressure on the media, especially the public media. There has been a constant fight between the executive power and the media. The media were trying to publish some corruption affairs relating to the executive power, and the executive power was trying to gag the media. It has actually ended with massive demonstrations in which the Koreans were denouncing corruption affairs, and in which the media were able to be heard and to have the information they published taken in consideration. South Korea has ousted its past president. Actually, she was sorry, I don't find the term. She was she was officially dismissed for corruption.
Oh, yes. I
And
guess
she's
yes, she was
currently, yeah,
impeached or something. Yes.
impeached. Thank you. Yes, yes, she was impeached for corruption, and she's currently in jail under a quite harsh sentence for very, very important facts of corruption. Um, this has actually triggered a movement in the opposite direction. South Koreans have elected a president who is a former human rights lawyer, human rights defender, who was, in his youth, actually a political prisoner under the dictatorship. And President Moon Jae-in in South Korea, I would say, has engaged in much better relationship with the media. Not to say that it's perfect at all, but let's say that the current executive power in South Korea is trying to have a much more open approach of their relationship with the media. There are still in South Korea a lot of things to change. For example, there is still a national security regulation that threatens journalists from a heavy prison sentence for publishing stories that might reveal what they consider as state secrets or secrets of national security importance. But I would say it's not being applied, and the tendency is rather to improvements. Reporters Without Borders actually visited President Moon Jae-in last September, and we are currently pushing his administration to reform the legal dispositions for freedom of the press, so that, let's say, everything archaic would be removed, and that South Korea would truly become the leader in press freedom in the region.
Excellent. So my last question for you is, we're all in this very extremely unusual era of COVID-19 right now. Entire populations have been locked down into their houses. Whether or not it's a soft lockdown or a hard lockdown varies from place to place. But it's clearly a very sensitive time, a time of change in world history. Looking at the situation of press freedom in East Asia, the countries under your mandate, do you see this COVID-19 crisis as exercising an effect, or is it more or less irrelevant to the trajectory of press freedom in this area?
Well, the effect is of course limited because the East Asian countries, although COVID-19 originates from East Asia, but have been relatively spared if I compare with Europe or the USA. However, what we have seen, of course, is that the Chinese regime has taken that opportunity to apply even more censorship and even more surveillance on the internet, which is, of course, the proof that they haven't learned the lesson of the crisis, because the coronavirus epidemic's outbreak is the result of the fact that censorship didn't not allow to launch the alert early enough. So in the case of China, there is even more censorship and even more pressure on the social media due to the coronavirus. In North Korea, it's difficult to know, but I would say that it doesn't change much because there was no journalism at all. In the case of democracies, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and also Mongolia, because we haven't talked of Mongolia, but actually they have the merit of being a democracy that is respectful of freedom of the press at a level that is quite similar to the one of Japan, although they are stuck between two major authoritarian powers, which are Russia and China. So in our four democracies, COVID-19 hasn't changed so much, but of course we are vigilant. We insist that governments would refrain from taking authoritarian measures and would refrain from turning any measure they take into something permanent. It's very important in this time of crisis that we would protect freedoms and individual freedoms as much as possible, because experience shows that in time of crisis, the public can accept more easily that the government would remove some of their freedoms. But usually governments have a tendency not to come back to the original situation after the crisis. So there is always a little percentage of freedom removals that remains after the crisis. So it's very important that the citizens are vigilant and that they pressure on the government so that freedoms would not be permanently altered after the crisis.
I understand. Well, we're just about at the end here. Is there any final comment that you would like to make before we wrap up the interview?
I will I will introduce briefly the Tracker 19, which is a project Reporters Without Borders has launched on its website at the time of the coronavirus outbreak. It's a mini website on our website that allows our readers to have direct access to every coronavirus related information. So you are welcome to visit rsf.org, which is our website. And I would insist on the most important message that COVID-19 crisis is teaching us. After this crisis, no one can ever say that censorship in a country is only the problem of this country's people. Censorship is a global problem. It can threaten lives even far away from the place where it is applied. And it's very important that democracies would mobilize everywhere in the world so that in the future information can circulate in an open way without such a censorship.
Well, those are certainly sentiments that you get 100% agreement from me. All right.